Peace, everybody. It's your brother, Marc Lamont Hill. Welcome to the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel, where we have critical conversation, political education, and radical responses to mainstream media. Today, I am very, very fortunate to have an incredible conversation on deck with one of the greatest minds of our time, one of the most important scholars of a generation, and one of the most important voices in pursuit of justice, specifically in the area of Israel and Palestine. His name is Dr. Norman Finkelstein, and he joins us right now. Professor, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
You have been very busy as of late. You know, as a scholar of the Middle East, I've read your work carefully and thoughtfully, I think, and most of us have. But now the entire world is reading you and watching your interviews and listening to you push back against some of the most confusing, dishonest, imprecise, decontextualized arguments about Israel and Palestine. So we're grateful that you're out here and lending your voice in this way. And I'm glad you're able to hang out with us for a little bit. I want to start with this question of October 7th. It's an important moment. Obviously, it will go down as one of the most important moments or dates in the history of the region, I suspect. And much of the response that Israel has given to Hamas is rooted in October 7th. Much of what we've seen since October 7th is rooted on the actions of Hamas on October 7th. How important is it for us to sort of contextualize what's going on beyond just October 7th?
If you begin from the assumption that Hamas are homicidal murderers, that it's in their DNA, and for that matter, all the people in Gaza are homicidal, anti-Semitic murderers, because Israel has been emphatic that we shouldn't make any distinction between Hamas and the civilian population in Gaza. So if you take, if you start from the assumption that these are all homicidal, it's in their DNA, then really you can begin at October 7th, because right. October 7th would just be a last, they had the opportunity to act out this age-old exterminationist aspiration. If you don't start from that assumption, then it seems to me that October 7th was the climax and culmination of the brutal dehumanization of the people of Gaza, a dehumanization which had a, you might call, a daily component, that is this 20-year-long siege of Gaza, such that nobody can go in, nobody can go out, with the rarest of exceptions. Nothing, no item can go in, and no item can go out without permission by the state of Israel. There were times where Israel calibrated the caloric intake of individual Gazans such that they didn't allow in food more than a subsistence or starvation plus diet for the people of Gaza. There were periods where Israel banned everything from chocolate to baby chicks to potato chips from entering Gaza. So to repeat, nothing went in and nothing went out without Israel's approval. And that approval was at a very low threshold, calibrated calorically by the state of Israel. It's not surprising, just given those two aspects, of the situation, that the economy of Gaza was basically, as Sarah Roy, the leading economist on Gaza, she described it in her book, her standard work, as the de-development, the destruction of Gaza's economy. As of now, Gaza doesn't have an economy. It's a notional economy. It's wholly dependent on foreign subsidies. There's nothing there in the way of an economy. It's been destroyed. Unemployment in Gaza is about 50%. Among young people, it ranges, I think, between the ages of 15 and 25, something like that. Unemployment is up to about 70%, and it's among the highest, if not the highest, of any area in the world. Food insecurity, what's called by international humanitarian organizations, the term is extreme food insecurity. About half the population, in concrete terms, it means half the population never experienced a full stomach after a meal. And about 80% of Gaza's population survives on handouts, international subsidies. So that's the daily experience of the people of Gaza for the past 20 years. The young people, the young men who burst the gates of Gaza, that's what they had experienced for the past 20 years. They had no past, they had no present, they had no future. All that was left to them to do each day was to get up and pace the perimeter of that 25-mile long, shorter than a marathon, and 5-mile wide parcel of land, which is among the most densely populated places on God's earth. Otherwise, it was just a black hole, their lives. So that's, as I said, to use the language that we used to find in encyclopedias, they would have an entry called flora and fauna, which meant plant life and animal life. Well, that is the flora and fauna of Gaza. But that daily life was punctuated by these periodic, what Israel calls operations against Gaza, what Israel calls the mowing of the lawn.
Let me pause you there for one second, because I want to get into this sort of mowing of the lawn, which is a repugnant, sort of morally atrocious idea that has been sort of verified by numerous sources. But there have been people who have challenged your depiction of the flora and fauna of Gaza. You appeared on a talk show of sorts with three people, but two were primarily engaging you. They were comedians. I was sort of surprised to see you in that context.
I think if you don't mind me stopping you just for a moment, I don't think that's correct. There was the owner of the comedy club, a person named Noam Dworman, and then there was a person who's reputed to be a political commentator, Eli Lake.
Yes.
Now, I don't follow the web. I'm a book person, but I understand that he used to be a political commentator for an outlet called The Daily Beast. So he doesn't advertise himself as a comedian, though maybe some of his comments misled people into believing he was one.
The snark didn't help. You're absolutely right. He the owner of the comedy club sort of engaged you. You're absolutely right. And Eli was very sort of intense but somewhat dismissive of your analysis, which is fine. What I thought was interesting, though, was not so much the conversation, because there were a lot of sort of standard boilerplate Zionist talking points that you were dismantling. But it was afterward when I saw Coleman Hughes, who is a fairly well-known African-American political commentator who has worked for conservative think tanks. He's an opponent of reparations. He's an opponent of affirmative action, I believe. He also responded to you, and he's responded on other conservative outlets as well. And then yesterday, Mr. Hughes wrote a blog called "What Are Conditions in Gaza Like?" I wanted to give you just a few lines of what he said to get your response, because what he said in many ways is representative of what many people who are pro-Israel have argued. He said, of course, he's been consuming a lot of your work, and he said, according to Finkelstein and other critics of Israel, pre-war conditions in Gaza were beyond hellish. Finkelstein regularly calls it the Gaza concentration camp, and the phrase open air prison has been widely used for more than a decade. He then breaks down some of the points that you've just argued around water, around electricity, around food, etc. But then he makes a counter argument. He says that when he looked at, he said he decided to look at the data to find out life expectancy at birth and under 5 mortality rates, and of course, infant mortality. And he said he expected the numbers to correspond with what you said. And he said what he actually found were, quote, numbers that make Gaza look like a typical developing nation. He says, according to the CIA World Book, life expectancy in Gaza is 75.7 years. He said if Gaza were a country, that would put it in the 46th percentile of all nations. He said the CIA World Factbook puts infant mortality in Gaza at 14.9 per 1,000. That puts it at 43% in the world nations, and much better than the global average, which was 28. He pulled out some other data and other papers to talk about life expectancy, under 5 mortality rates. And effectively what he's saying is Gaza isn't great, but it's not radically different than other developing nations. I want to pin that up, and I'm going to bring one more piece of the equation rather for you to respond to, and that is the people who say, regardless of what these conditions are, and even if we concede the fact that Israel redeployed its troops in end of 2005, 2006 to the perimeter, Hamas is still responsible for some of that unemployment. Hamas is still responsible for the life expectancy, that they had an opportunity to do development work and instead they didn't. So there's the argument of it's not exactly true what Finkelstein is saying. He's over dramatizing the situation. And then there's even if it is true, why aren't you holding Hamas accountable? Those are the two kind of dominant arguments I'm seeing circulating, and I'd love to give you a chance to respond to both of them.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I did catch some of what Mr. Coleman Hughes and another guest, I guess his name is Michael Moynihan. I don't know these names because I'm not a web person, but I think that's his name. Michael Moynihan went on to say that if you look at videos of Gaza City, you see malls, you see kids having a good time.
Yeah.
And then he went on to say that he checked and he saw that Gazans are always going on vacation to Europe, and it was really a jolly good time.
Yes.
And my initial reaction was, I go back a long ways. This week I'll be celebrating my seventh decade, if celebrate is the proper description. I think mourning comes closer to it, but leaving that aside, there was a time during the civil rights movement in the 1960s when conservative white commentators would make the point that, why are you complaining? Meaning African Americans, you're doing a lot better than anybody in Africa. And it would bring out exactly the same statistics as Mr. Coleman Hughes adduced namely life expectancy, infant mortality, exact same statistics, and said to African Americans holed up in ghettos and living lives of, this is pre-civil rights, pre-civil rights legislation.
Right.
I assume Coleman Hughes would not want to make the point that life in pre-civil rights legislation in the United States was a bowl full of cherries. I would hope he wouldn't want to make that argument. But white conservative commentators constantly used that kind of argument. Why are you complaining? You're doing so much better than your brethren in Africa. Later, there was a whole school of academics. They were called Cleometricians. And there was a famous book put out called Time on the Cross. And that was purported to demonstrate that slavery wasn't all that bad, because slaves actually made out better than free workers in our economy. And the truth be told, those arguments in and of themselves, there is an element of truth to it. So I was reading for another book I wrote, unrelated to Israel, Palestine. I was doing a lot of reading of W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes.
And at one point, Du Bois makes the point. He says he compares slave labor with quote unquote free labor. Remember, this is before unions, and it was pretty brutal.
Right. For the benefit of the audience, you're talking about Black Reconstruction.
I think this is Black. Black Reconstruction.
It's Black Reconstruction, and the first 3 chapters of Black Reconstruction deal with the slave, the white worker, and the planter. And this is the context where Du Bois is offering his kind of revisionist history of the Reconstruction era. I just want to give the audience some intellectual context for what you're doing. Go ahead.
Good. I'm glad you remember that. And he says that, and I'm quoting him, the economic amenities, the things that make life pleasant, of slavery, he said, listen to how he described slavery. He said the slave is, quote, protected by a certain primitive sort of old age pension, job insurance, sickness insurance. Just as an anecdote on that regard, Frederick Douglass wrote a famous open letter to his former slave master, Captain Auld, A-U-L-D. And one of the things he accused Captain Auld of having done was, when his mother was too old to work, he discarded her. And that was considered a shame in slave culture. And later, it's an interesting fact, Douglass apologized to Auld because it turned out to be incorrect. Auld did take care of his mother when she was too old. So Du Bois makes the completely surprising statement. He says, well, truth be told, slavery protected the slave by a certain primitive sort of old age pension and job insurance and health insurance and so forth. But that doesn't change his opinion. It doesn't change his opinion that he says that slavery, the Negro slaves in America, represented the worst and lowest conditions among modern laborers. In particular, they suffered absolute subjection to the individual will of an owner and the cruelty and injustice that attended this subjection. So, as I said, My first reaction to Coleman Hughes was, well, this sounds awfully like the arguments that were made by the white conservatives in the 60s, the defenders of the peculiar institution,
Yeah.
and also the arguments of the cleometricians. And I said, and I admit there's an element of truth to it, just as Du Bois, who was an absolutely scrupulously honest historian, because he never feared facts, never feared truth, absolutely fearless in the face of truth. He acknowledged there were aspects of slavery which were, quote unquote, more humane than free labor.
Right.
So now here's the question I have for Mr. Hughes, who I suspect will at some point hear this broadcast. I'm not going to address these questions about happy people at malls. Anybody familiar with, for example, the Warsaw Ghetto will know that even amidst the most extreme despondence and poverty, there's always a class of people who manage to figure out how to make do and live it up. In
Right.
the Warsaw Ghetto, they were famously called, I heard about them at home a lot because both of my parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto. They were called the 13. And the 13 meant those smugglers, collaborators, traitors who lived on 13 Lenchko Street. They were the 13. So the fact that there are some people living well in Gaza is altogether unsurprising for those who are familiar with those types of situations. Now,
But just so people have clarity on this, though, that's an important distinction to make. You're not saying that it's inaccurate that there are people who are living lavishly. You're saying that represents a small slice of the Gazan population.
Yes, exactly like in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Right.
And then here is the question I have for Mr. Hughes. The question is this. He says my use of the locution concentration camp is exaggerated. At one point, I think he described it as me lying and things like that.
Yeah.
Fair enough. You can claim I have an agenda and I am tailoring my language to further my agenda. But here's my question for Mr. Hughes. If you were now Marc Lamont Hill, if you were to go onto your little computer device and enter the word Giora, Giora, Island, Eiland, okay?
Yeah.
And then you enter concentration camp.
Yes.
Okay. And now you're going to find a memorandum from March 2004. And if you scroll down to number 12, paragraph 12, you're going to see Giora Island. And how does he describe Gaza?
Concentration camp.
A huge concentration camp.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Hughes, here is my question to you. Giora Island was the head of Israel's National Security Council, the equivalent of our head of the CIA, Mr. Burns now. He's clearly knowledgeable about these subjects. He's making this statement describing Gaza as, quote, a huge concentration camp before Israel even imposed the blockade of Gaza. The blockade of Gaza was imposed in January 2006. He makes this statement in March 2004. Why do you think he said that? Do you think that Mr. Island has an agenda like Norman Finkelstein? Mr. Island is a completely bestial, knowledgeable but bestial character. In the past few weeks, he said we should make Gaza uninhabitable. He
Yeah.
said the epidemics in the south of Gaza are a good thing. He said that we have to keep up, even when the international community starts showing pictures of those incubators with babies dying in it. This is Giora Island. So obviously
he's not a war dove, and he's not an anti-Zionist.
Right. He's not in my camp.
Yeah.
And we will grant, when you talk about a middle developing country, I would think of Ecuador. I've been in Ecuador, a very pleasant place, a middle developing country. People aren't extremely poor. They're not extremely rich. Nobody going into Ecuador would describe it as a concentration camp.
Right.
That would be a very far-fetched description, but according to Coleman Hughes, roughly the same. Ecuador, Gaza.
Right.
So why is it that Mr. Island used that locution to describe Gaza? Now, if you open up page 169 of Baruch Kemmerling's book, Politicide,
yes,
he describes Gaza on page 169. He describes it as, quote, the biggest concentration camp ever to exist, or largest concentration camp ever to exist. Why did a senior academic at the Hebrew University, why did he use that descriptive? It was just a developing country like Gaza, where people went to the mall, they had burgers and fries at McDonald's, and every once in a while, they went on a European vacation. It's an interesting thing, since nobody can go out of Gaza.
Right, and there's no airport. It's a fascinating argument.
How that occurred. Let me take one last person. Israel's leading authority, and probably the leading authority in the world on life in Gaza. Sarah Roy is the leading authority on the economics of Gaza. I think I can claim, it's a tiny distinction, like the tallest building in Wichita, Kansas, but I can claim to have the most knowledge of the political history of Gaza. But the person with life experience and a stickler for detail is Amira Haas. She lived in Gaza for a sustained period of time. She wrote a classic book on her experience living in Gaza. She's Israel's, she's the journalist on Haaretz, Israel's most distinguished, not mass selling, but distinguished newspaper. She's their
paper of record.
Paper of record. She's their authority on the occupied territories, she and Gideon Levy. Now, let me just say a couple of things about Amira Haas before I read what she had to say. First of all, she's a stickler for detail. Second of all, her family passed through the Nazi Holocaust. Third of all, not trivially, she detests Hamas. Detests, loathes Hamas. Sometimes, in my opinion, it distorts her judgment, but she would probably say the fact that I don't loathe and detest Hamas distorts my judgment, and we just have to agree to disagree. I'd like Mr. Coleman Hughes listen to this woman, daughter of survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, hypersensitive to facts. I would say she is a genuine rival to me, to facts, to truth, and also has what Mr. Coleman doesn't have, life experience living there. And here she writes, it's a little long, but I want to read it.
Sure.
The Gaza Strip today, or I should give you the date. The date is, I think it was about 3 years ago. I didn't copy it, about 3 years ago. The Gaza Strip today is a concentration camp. but not like Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. That was one of the Nazi concentration camps. The differences are clear and known. This writer, meaning herself, is opposed to parallels, lacking information, knowledge, and understanding, drawn for purposes of provocation. But this writer is also opposed to creating hierarchies of suffering, which, whether concealed or openly, justify any suffering that does not reach the climax which we, the Jews, define, meaning she's against those who say it's not the Holocaust. It's terrible, it's awful, but it's not the Holocaust.
Right.
And so she says, in the Gaza Strip, which is closed off like a confined and separated camp, live some 2 million people in one of the most densely populated places in the world. About 70% of them are the descendants of refugees expelled from their homes. Absent freedom of movement, condemn them to a life of unemployment, a life of dreariness, a life of poverty, a life of disease, a life of depression, a life of contaminated water and soil, and dependence on ever-dwindling charity. And that is even without the military bombings and incursions, the mowing of the lawn, which we'll get to in a moment.
Absolutely.
Bergen-Belsen, as a prisoners' camp, and thereafter as a concentration camp and extermination camp for Jews, it was dismantled after about 4 years of existence with the defeat of the Third Reich. The concentration camp that is Gaza has existed under I have to be careful with the words. The concentration camp that is Gaza has existed under ever harsher conditions for almost 3 decades. Contrary to Israeli propaganda, it was created before the suicide bombings, before the Oslo Accord of 1993, before Hamas took charge and developed its military skills. Israel has a political goal in mind in turning Gaza into a giant concentration camp, cutting it and its inhabitants off from the rest of the Palestinians so that it will become a separate entity deprived of history, roots, and belonging. Well, that's Gaza. So my question, it's a genuine perplexity, assuming good faith by Coleman Hughes, and he's not just pandering to his subscribers. Assuming good faith, I would want to know, why would Giora Island, called a huge concentration camp, why would Baruch Kimmerling call it the largest concentration camp ever? Why would Amira Haas call it a giant concentration camp? That just genuinely perplexes me.
But let's because what I don't want them to do, though, Norm, what one could argue, if I were to play devil's advocate, is that well, 2 things. One, you're appealing to authority, and you're appealing to the expertise and analysis of people who you otherwise would be dismissive of, but also that they could just be wrong. If we don't appeal to authority, and if we don't, and instead we actually dissect the argument itself, what are the conditions that must be in place to satisfy the conditions of being a concentration camp? And then the subsequent question would be, does Gaza meet that standard? And the reason why I ask this is not to just engage in a kind of philosophical exercise, although I think for me, it'd be worth it just on its own, but because this is a consistent debate and challenge that we see emerge in the Palestinian movement and the pro-Palestinian movement is if we say that Israel is an apartheid state, people will say, no, it's nothing like South Africa. If people say, well, it's a genocide, people will say, well, look, the population is growing and it's nothing like it's nothing like Cambodia. It's nothing like Uganda at times. It's nothing like Congo. It's not, in fact, just any place where our recently deceased former Secretary of State has been. You can probably fill in the blank there. It's not like any of those places, but instead it's different. And that by using the language of concentration camp, we're smuggling in
an agenda.
An agenda, and a very specific one, though, right? Not just an agenda, but a specific one, right? Which is to demonize the Jewish state, which is to frame them as Nazis, part 2, which is to ignore the complexities of the region. So I would say, first, what makes, again, I keep asking you these double-barrel questions, and forgive me, because I have to do this. I rarely get this type of space with you.
Look, there are 10,000 videos of me now on YouTube. So if you want to say something interesting, then you have to ask me the tough questions.
Fair enough.
I'll just be repeating myself.
Right, which is not interesting, right? So I agree. So then the question becomes, right, what makes a concentration camp outside of someone else saying, I think it's a concentration camp, because we certainly wouldn't agree. If they disagreed, we wouldn't be appealing to them. And then the second question is, which is so in some sense a praxis-driven question, is what are we afforded, and what do we lose when we draw that type of comparison, whether it's apartheid, whether it's concentration camp, whether it's genocide, whether it's ethnic cleansing, these types of, whether it's pogrom, what do we get for that?
Okay, very good questions. And I'm glad you're playing what's a critical role in trying to achieve truth, which is playing the role of the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
When we want to figure out whether what's happening, say, in Gaza is a genocide, you can look at a dictionary, but then it's one person's definition, one person's interpretation of the definition versus another. So what is normally done? You'll know because you've done it. You call in experts, people who claim a certain professional expertise in genocide, to parse the term, its legal term, and whether it applies in the case of, say, the present moment, Gaza. The second thing we look for when we evaluate evidence, it's what's called in law evidence against interest. If you said, I didn't kill my wife, okay, that's not going to carry the day if you're being accused of murder. However, if you said, I did kill my wife, as a matter of fact, and I'm very happy I did. Well, it's possible that you're legally insane, and that's why you said it. But that's evidence against interest. And therefore, it carries much more weight in a court of law and a court of public opinion. So what did I do when I gave my 3 examples? Right. I can pull off the shelf right now a definition of concentration camp, as many people have done in the course of trying to prove me wrong or prove me right. They've pulled off the Merriam-Webster's definition, and they say, well, as a matter of fact, Finkelstein is correct. A concentration camp is the coercive containment of people in a limited space, and technically he's correct. But I didn't do that. I didn't use the dictionary style. I didn't just pull off. I tried to do something else. Number one, we can say at the very least for the head of Israel's national security establishment, Giora Eiland, that as that occupying that position and also being Jewish, and here it's not an irrelevant fact, he would know what a concentration camp is. And you can assume, because he's such a right-wing fanatical, if I can use the term, I don't particularly like it, but fanatical Zionist, you can assume he wouldn't use that word in a glib fashion to describe Palestinians. And yet, knowing the situation as he does, that locution immediately leapt to mind. It's a huge concentration camp. There's nothing to argue here. There's nothing to debate here. It's just perfectly obvious to the naked eye. The second person I chose was Baruch Kimmerling, who was a senior sociologist at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. That credential ought, as it would in any other debate, carry weight. And the third person I chose was a person, Amir Haas, who A, lived in Gaza, B, is notorious for being a stickler on facts and detail, and 3, professedly loathes Hamas and could never be found extenuating or apologizing for it.
Right.
So those seem to me to be very worthy pieces of testimony and evidence. And I do find it perplexing, leaving aside the fantasies about European trips, leaving aside that kind of sheer lunacy by Mr. Moynihan, I do find it perplexing that these 3 individuals who I named couldn't distinguish between a concentration camp and Ecuador. I find that very hard to compute. And I also said the kinds of argument that Coleman Hughes made were just very commonplace with African Americans in the pre-civil rights era. I remember one guy came on, he was African American, and he was a Coleman Hughes of his day.
Yeah.
Said, and I'm not saying this in a pejorative sense to Coleman Hughes. I don't know him from Adam. I don't find him particularly interesting or particularly bright.
That's fair.
I have nothing. This is not.
He's no Ben Shapiro. He's no child prodigy.
Yeah, to the extent that Ben Shapiro is a child prodigy, except in his Jewish mother's eyes, and every Jewish mother thinks their son or daughter is a child prodigy. But leave that aside. I don't. You just caused me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgive me.
In the 1960s, I remember, it was the civil rights era. It was my youth. You remember these sorts of things. There was an African American who came on. He was a kind of what you might call a pre-Coleman Hughes. And he said, if we were in Africa, we'd still be swinging on trees. That's what he said.
Yeah.
And actually, there was a guy who responded to him, I thought, in a quite clever way. He said, as far as I know, the only one who swung on trees in Africa was Tarzan, and he was white.
Which is very true.
Yeah, I thought it was a very insightful comment. But those kinds of arguments are very familiar.
And sadly, Norman, I just want to be clear, because you evoked Du Bois earlier, and again, for the audience, the purpose of this channel is education. This isn't like a media network as much as it is.
I found Du Bois very honest.
Yeah, but
there are ways in which slavery was better than free labor.
Yeah, but I'm going somewhere different though. But Du Bois was also at a very similar to Coleman Hughes kind of position on Palestine. I don't know if you've ever read his writing on Palestine. But if not, I'll send you a very interesting.
There's nothing surprising about that, because you have to remember, you have to know history. The colonizers of Palestine were completely on the left. They were right. A large portion of them were totally pro-Soviet, pro-Stalin. I mean, in ways which are kind of insane. They were pro-Soviet, pro-Stalin. They saw themselves as part of the international left. Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, he imagined himself to being a Jewish Lenin. That was their worldview. So it was, Palestine was, at that point, it was a leftist cause. As you know, the Soviet Union immediately recognized the state of Israel on its creation. So it's not surprising that Du Bois, because he was in that camp, and you have to remember, there are so many historical facts that have to remember. The left was very sympathetic to the Jews because of the fight against fascism and the Nazi extermination.
Right. And the Black nationalist movement was also sympathetic for its own sort of reasons. Marcus Garvey, Du Bois, etc. I thought it was interesting, though.
Paul Robeson was the greatest defender of the Jewish people during the Nazi Holocaust. His mastery of Yiddish was breathtaking. My father, when he would listen to Paul Robeson sing in Yiddish, what came to be called the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance song, it's really the partisan song, he was mesmerized. I mean, he was mesmerized to the point that we had back then, the old-fashioned record players with the needle on the handle. And he wanted to hear it again. And he lifted the handle again, and lifted the handle again, and lifted it until he scratched the whole record.
Wow.
I mean, that was Paul Robeson. The Jewish people loved Paul Robeson, loved him because of his devotion to the Jews in the moment of their suffering. So it was a very different cause back then, or its understanding was very different back then.
For sure. I just wanted to make sure the audience didn't walk away thinking that pre sort of civil rights Civil Rights Act, or even pre, sort of 1968, I'll say, when King passes. I don't want people to think that the advocacy for the state of Israel, or even advocacy for the early Yishuv prior to 1948 was purely like a conservative movement. But as you just pointed out, it was a Black radical movement, a mainstream Black nationalist movements. And Du Bois, of course, writes Ethics of the Problem of Palestine, which becomes an op-ed called The Case for the Jews in 1948, where he articulates not just sort of grand aspirations for nationalism, but he uses words like Mohammedism and empty, and phrases like empty land. I mean, he's echoing some very problematic Zionist points.
A lot of people on the left said that. The great Marxist historian Isaac Deutscher, if you look at his writings from the 1950s, he said the same thing about the empty land. Yeah. And truth be told, I'm very much in admiration of Du Bois's commitment to truth. There was a case to be made for the Jews in 1948. And we have to acknowledge that the most moving speech on behalf of Jews at the UN General Assembly in 1947 did not come from the Americans. It came from Gromyko, the foreign minister of Russia. And it was the most ennobling speech one could imagine in the halls of the UN. Because, the Russian people lost 27 million Russians died during World War II.
Right.
And along comes Gromyko, and he said, I wish the Jews and Arabs in Palestine could get along. But if they can't, if there's no possibility of them finding, the term modus vivendi, a way to live together, he said, the Jewish suffering during World War II was of such a magnitude that he said, if they can't get along, then they should get a state. That's Gromyko. Yeah. So I think there's an argument there. There are many points where you can discuss this, that, and the other, and make all sorts of what's called caveating.
Let me pick up there just for time's sake, because I want to pivot to something else, and then we're going to come back to this mowing the lawn thing, which I think is incredibly important that we have to talk about. But you just said something that stuck with me a little bit, which is this idea that the events of 1948, or the events leading to 1948, rather, in the minds of many, served as an ample justification for the formation of the state of Israel. And of course, I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea. Well, let me not say that. There are people who would certainly disagree with the idea, with that idea. But again, the devil's always in the detail. As we continue now, last week we saw a House bill, House Resolution 888, which was signed by almost every member of Congress affirmatively. I remember the House of Representatives affirmatively. Rashida Tlaib voted present. One Republican congressman, I believe, voted no. The rest voted yes. And in this resolution, it effectively was arguing ostensibly for Israel's right to exist. And all the whereases that make up a resolution amounted to Jews are ancestrally tied to the land. They've been subjected to persecution throughout the world after they were kicked out of what they now call Israel. That 1948 created a new sense of, the Nazi Holocaust created a new sense of urgency around the formation of the state of Israel. That Jews have a right to self-determination, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and that fighting Hamas, it was also in there. The point being, everyone signed this. This was like kissing a baby. This was the most uncontested, resolution I've seen in the House in a long time of such import. And the fact that even the so-called left in Congress, and I'm using that in very sharp air quotes, signed it without comment or without pushback, at least public pushback, brings me to this question that I don't think we ever adequately get to in polite company and in public space. And that is, do we want to concede that Israel has a right to exist, or even to that language? In my book 3 years ago, I raised that question of the right to exist. Again, of course, Jews have a right to exist. Of course, land has a right to countries have a right to have their territorial integrity respected, et I'm not talking about safety here, but it seems to me when we just uncritically say and affirm that that Israel has a right to exist, we're really saying Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. And if we concede that territory, one, are we giving up too much intellectual and political and moral ground? And two, does that foreclose on all the political possibilities that might actually get us peace in the region?
Look, it's a very fair question. The concept of right to exist originated as from the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 242, the right to exist in peace with its neighbors. That's right. What right to exist means. It didn't bear on the content of the state. It just bore on the fact that Israel is a member state of the United Nations. As a member state of the United Nations, it has the same rights and obligations as any other member state. And one of its rights is the right to live in peace with its neighbors. It's, I think, the second preambular paragraph of UN Resolution 242.
Yes, which is in 1967, just for the audience. Again, this is after the 1967 war. The two major resolutions were 242 and 338, one for ceasefire and two for what Professor Finkelstein is talking about now. Yes, good.
Okay. But obviously the question arises exactly as you pose it. What do you mean by its right to exist as a Jewish state? And there, I think you have to make discriminations. For example, England defines itself as an Anglican state. Does that self-definition significantly impinge on the rights of non-Anglicans in the UK? I think if you ask most non-Anglicans in the UK, they would say, not very significant in terms of my rights.
They might not even know it's an Anglican state.
Right. Excuse me?
I said they may not even know that it defines itself as an Anglican state.
Absolutely correct. The United States is in effect, whether we like it or not, it's in effect a Christian state. Christmas is the national holiday. It's not Hanukkah, and it's not what is the
Eid? It's not like the Eid.
It's Christmas. Wake up, smell the coffee. In many ways, this is a Christian state. Does that really impinge much on my rights as a Jew here? Answer, no. I mean, it doesn't break my heart that there is a Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center and not a menorah or whatever. It's not the end of the world for me. And for some Jews, actually, it is a problem because they are very committed to Saturday being the day of Sabbath, if they're religious, rather than Sunday, which is our effective day of Sabbath. And it's not the Muslim Friday either. It's not Friday, it's not Saturday, it's Sunday, because we are, or our roots are a Christian, go back to Christianity. So I think what one has to look at is substantively, what does it mean when Israel describes itself as a Jewish state? And when you look at the substance, there's just a very large body of law which discriminates against non-Jews in ways that significantly affect their life chances in Israeli society. That's only one half. That's the Jewish population, the non-Jewish population of Israel. About 20% of the population is,
right.
I think it's 20% is not Jewish. You can
Yep.
correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
But there's a second very fundamental fact. There's only one state at this point between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. There's only one state, because under international law, what distinguishes an occupation from an illegal annexation, what distinguishes it is one fundamental fact. An occupation is temporary. If it's not temporary, it's an illegal annexation. Now, Israel occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza in 1967. We're already at 2023, headed towards 2024.
My God.
I don't think anybody can seriously make the case that this is temporary anymore. This is permanent. It's been annexed. So if you look at the population, there are 14 million people living between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. 14 million. Of those 14 million, 5 million, namely the inhabitants of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, have no rights whatsoever. They don't have the right of citizenship and everything that derives from citizenship. They have no rights whatsoever. And about 2 million, namely the Palestinian Arabs of Israel, they have some rights, but second-class rights. And so if you say Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish state, at this point, the Jewish state includes the West Bank and Gaza. So then you're in effect saying that Israel has the right to completely disenfranchise 5 million people and accord second-class citizenship to 2 million people. Now, if that's your understanding of a Jewish state, I don't see how that can possibly pass muster as a legitimate state. It's no more legitimate than apartheid South Africa was, and the international community reached a consensus, except for Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, reached a consensus that South Africa was an illegitimate state as it was then constituted.
Let me push a little further, because I'm already anticipating people saying, well, you know, what's happening in the West Bank has taken longer than expected. Gaza's a mess, but it could be fixed. Let's concede that just for a moment. If Israel were to exist, if we were to get to this magical, elusive, quixotic two-state solution, and suddenly there were a Palestinian state, and all we had left of Israel proper was the actual Israel doesn't really have defined borders, but let's just say the territory that we now regard as the West Bank and Gaza is not part of Israel, and the territory that we call maybe even East Jerusalem is not Gaza. Let's say all that is not Israel, and it's just Israel proper. You know, if it were to function the way it does, with a 20% population, roughly give or take, of Arab Palestinians of Israel, as they call them, Palestinian Israelis, and a small population of Druze and some other folk. Would it be morally problematic, legally problematic, or otherwise troublesome to be a Jewish state? In other words, I don't want your critique of the Jewish state to rest. I don't want to give you an easy out and have it rest exclusively on the fact that there's an illegal occupation and a siege, right? What do we think about as a more fundamental matter, whether or not the right to an ethno state or religious state or whatever you wanted to call it is okay, and that people, or if people even have a right to it?
As I said, it all depends on the legal and real substance of that ethno state. I think all states have an ethnic component to them. France claims it has this French secular component to itself. It includes Catholicism in its secular identity. Every state has an ethnic component. The question is the extent to which it impinges on the equality of rights of the citizens, bearing in mind that in every state, a majority has certain rights over a minority, namely what we call majority rule. So certain things, in our own constitution,
by virtue of their ethnicity, right? Like I don't get a majority rule. I don't get to control the destiny of the country because I'm African or because I'm Black or because I'm whatever the thing might be.
Yeah, and that's because our Constitution has certain amendments that protect individual rights and protect citizens from various kinds of discrimination. We have that 14th Amendment, which speaks to equality under the law. And that amendment has been interpreted to mean that no majority can command the right to discriminate under the law against any minority. Also, by the way, against majorities like whites, it's been interpreted, in the course of the, as you know, affirmative action cases, that you can't also, under the law, discriminate against white people. So you have both majority rule, but also protections for minorities within the context of majority rule. If you ask me, Israel, roughly speaking, these things are so rough and ready. It resembles the situation when we're talking about Israel. I'm talking about pre-June 67 Israel, not the West Bank, not Gaza, not East Jerusalem. It's more or less the American South before the Civil Rights era. The various kinds of impingements on Black rights here. Yes, the Palestinians have the right to vote in Israel. That's true. But technically, Black people had the right to vote too. It was just that there were all sorts of ways to block them from voting, or making it very difficult for them to vote. So I would say that there's really no such thing as a pure secular state. I think states always have what you might call an ethnic shadow to them. And then the question is, how obtrusive is that shadow in the life of ordinary citizens? And in the case of Israel, it clearly, pre-June 67, it clearly has a significant impact. There are so many laws, and everything from serving in the army and all the rights you get from serving in the army, but Arabs, with the exception of Druze, can't serve in the army. So you lose all the rights, everything from scholarships to this, to that, to that, to that, which derive from army service. Yeah. So that's how I would see it. I have to say, if we had achieved a situation where Palestinians in the occupied, I don't believe they're occupied anymore, in the illegally annexed territories, were able to live a reasonably decent life, to quote Coleman Hughes, a middle class, a middle developing country, then I would say things wouldn't be so terrible. And
Right.
then people in Israel could have their right. They would fight, launch a civil rights struggle, and hopefully gain enough support that they can gain their rights as African Americans did during the civil rights era. But that's not the situation we're living in. The situation we're living in is 5 million people without any rights. Of those 5 million people, 2.5 million people have been living in a concentration camp. And the people in the other half, the West Bank, they're now facing a very real danger, and I think it's a very realistic one, of a mass ethnic cleansing. If the conflict does not cool down, and right now the United States seems as if it does not want it to escalate. There are already troubles now, with the ships passing and being targeted by the Houthi rebels. And there's a real fear on the part of the US of it escalating.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are Israelis who want it to escalate because that will enable them to carry out a mass ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. Right now, you have what might be called a creeping ethnic cleansing, but there are those who would like to use the cover of a war to carry out a mass ethnic cleansing. And I think those are the most immediate concerns.
So help me think about how to get to a resolution for this.
I'm going to stop you short there because I think at this moment in time, it's a sheer fantasy to talk about resolution. It's not going to happen.
That's fair.
One has to look right now for addressing immediate questions, which is a ceasefire, ending the blockade of Gaza, and stopping the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank.
Now, I'm sorry. Maybe I've become so pragmatic in my life. That's what I meant by resolution. I didn't mean like a long term. I didn't mean like
I don't
free Palestine. Yeah. I'm sorry. I wasn't clear. What I mean is, in terms of how do we? Really, what I'm asking is, how do we get to a ceasefire? How do we end the blockade? How do we get to a place, maybe even of just elections? And the reason I ask that is because the Israeli government has been very clear in saying that their end game here is getting rid of all of Hamas. From what I can see, and based on Israel's own numbers, they may have killed 1,000, 1,500 as of last week. Hamas fighters, there's probably 20 to 30,000 of them. They can't literally kill all of Hamas's fighters. And if they do, it'll simply birth new ones. So at the end of the day here, either killing Hamas is a pretext to just wipe out the entire Gaza Strip, which is my deepest fear, or there has to be some kind of endpoint, some kind of off-ramp, some type of out. And there has to be a clear proposal for that, because right now Israel is saying, we won't negotiate with Hamas. We won't allow Hamas to be the ruling party under the condition of a ceasefire. And you have Palestinians reasonably saying, we're not going to allow another leadership movement. We're not going to allow the PA, the PLO, Fatah, whatever you want to call them. We're not allowing them in. No one can come in on the back of an Israeli tank. So how do you get to a place where self-rule happens, where a siege stops, where bombardment stops? As a practical matter, I mean, what's the first step? What's a reasonable ask? And I ask you in particular because you always pride yourself on being reasonable. Even if it's not the perfect solution, you don't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. So what is a reasonable step forward that would allow this disgusting genocide to stop, and that will allow a reasonable path towards something different?
Well, there are separate questions. There's a question of what Israel's goal is, and then there's this other question of how do you achieve the ceasefire. There's not been a consensus among Israeli leadership about what the goal is. Some have talked about expelling the Palestinians to the Sinai. Some have talked about making Gaza uninhabitable. And some have made clear, in particular the Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, that the Gazans are Amalek and every man, woman, and child has to be wiped out. So there hasn't been a consensus. That's one thing. A second thing is it's now become clear that a lot of their goals they cannot achieve. Egypt has called a mass expulsion to Sinai a red line. It won't accept it. So that seems out as an option. It may become an option. I can't predict if Israel herds everybody in one corner of Gaza. It may just burst, and they will find by hook or by crook a way to get into Sinai. That could happen, So Israel has now scaled down its goals because its more extravagant goals have proven unrealizable. So now their current goal in the name of destroying Hamas is not destroying Hamas as an organization, but bringing home the scalps of its three top leaders, Sinwar and two others. And then they can declare victory, which is important for Israel, that it can claim it won the war. So exactly what an Israeli victory would look like at this point, I think, is they managed to, so to speak, take out, I hate these military expressions, but I'll use them. If they managed to take out the three top leaders or two of the three top leaders of Hamas, and they can declare victory. As to the ceasefire, once they achieve that goal, assuming they do, then there could be a truce negotiated by the United States. However, we have to be careful. People say, "Oh, you can't trust Hamas because it breaks its words in ceasefires." As a factual matter, that's just not true. I've gone through the evidence very carefully. Hamas usually abides by the ceasefires. It's Israel for various pretexts, and the pretexts vary that breaks the ceasefires. But let's leave that aside for a moment. That factually, that's an incorrect statement. The more important point is, of course, Hamas is going to break the ceasefire eventually, because a ceasefire means a return to the status quo ante.
Right.
It means right back to the concentration camp. They're not going to accept that as a permanent settlement. So the ceasefire, in order to hold, has to include some component that resolves the conflict on the basis of, and here you quote me correctly, I'm practical about these things, on the basis of international law. So it has to include that component. Otherwise, of course, they're going to break it, because the status quo ante was intolerable. That's why October 7th happened.
Right.
And a ceasefire means leaving everything in place. So that can't work. That can't work. Okay, the U.S. government says, or Kamala Harris says, that the Palestinians in the south of Gaza have to have the right to go back to the north. That's what our government's official position is. Fine, that's a good thing to say. I'm all for saying that, even though there's not much to go back to. But let's leave that aside.
Yeah.
You're still inside a concentration camp.
Right.
So the goal of a ceasefire, I think it's certainly a critical demand, but it has to be linked with an end to the blockade. Otherwise, of course, it's going to break down at some point. And that's what always happens. If you look at the history, after each of the Israeli quote-unquote operations, mowings of the lawn, after each one, always in the final agreement, the ceasefire agreement, there's a clause about lifting the blockade every single time, and it's never lifted. As a matter of fact, after Pillar of Defense in 2012, Israel's Operation Pillar of Defense, Ehud Barak says, yeah, there's a clause about lifting the blockade, but the day after we sign this, nobody will remember. He was very cynical, and he was absolutely right.
He's absolutely correct.
He was absolutely right. The blockade just continued. So that's why I think not to create any illusions by saying, folks, it can't just be a ceasefire, because that's just breeding the next war. It has to be a ceasefire with, at bare minimum, the end to the blockade, which is under international law, a form of collective punishment and a war crime. So we have to eliminate the war crime beyond the ceasefire. Of course, I'm for the ceasefire, and unconditionally, I'm for it. But we shouldn't entertain any illusions it's going to last very long. If you mean that Israel is still going to decide who goes in, who goes out, what goes in, what goes out, controls the airspace, controls the waterways, controls everything, that's not going to last.
And given the events of October 7th, they have an even more justifiable security pretext for intensifying restrictions and maintaining everything.
First of all, they're going to declare at least half of the northern sector. They're going to declare it a buffer zone, a new security zone. That just is a given.
Right.
So another swath of Gaza will become inaccessible to the people of Gaza, who already live in among the most densely populated places on God's earth. So I'm going to have to leave now because I didn't eat yet. And
I was winding down anyway. So this is actually on that warm and fuzzy note, everybody. We are going to wind down. Professor Finkelstein, I could talk to you for hours, and hopefully you can come back and we can talk more, because at some point I'd love to talk about your intellectual trajectory, sort of where your mind has taken you and how that has shaped your politics and vice versa, and some of the many challenges, battles, adventures, misadventures you've had as a scholar who stands in a very interesting position in relationship to the American Academy. All of it is part of your story, and we'd love to talk to you about it. So hopefully you can come back again soon. Hopefully this was painless, though.
No, it was much more than painless. Those were good questions, and they were good observations, and I didn't repeat myself. And here was an opportunity to traverse new ground. And I'm glad for that opportunity. And I think you asked the right questions. So I'm grateful for that opportunity. Are we off air now?
We will be in 3 seconds. Everybody, I just want to thank you for watching the channel. Everybody, make sure you hit the like button if you appreciate content like this. Hit the subscribe button as well. Make sure you become a member of the channel so you get updates all the time about the new content that's coming out every single day. And of course, if you want, hit the join button. It helps for you to become a member of the MLH family, so that we can generate new space, create new conversations, widen the boundaries of intellectual production. We want to do all that stuff right here on the channel, because there ain't so many places in the world you can do that. So hit the join button, absolutely hit the subscribe button, and please hit the like button, and I'll see y'all again soon. Peace.